Ladies and gentlemen, this is an article from a Minnesota publication. Bonding, quote, a borrowing package to fund public construction projects across the state known as a bonding bill was at the top of the legislature's agenda this year before the pandemic. The bill has yet to recover its lost momentum, though leaders have agreed on a cap of $1.35 billion that may include money for rebuilding parts of Minneapolis and St. Paul damaged in the unrest after. So passing a bonding bill requires a 3/5 majority in each chamber. Getting that supermajority requires at least some House Republicans and Senate Democratic votes. And that's where reaching deals gets really complicated. In the House, Republican Minority Leader Kurt Dodd of Crown has softened on his earlier price for GOP votes. Walz giving up the emergency powers that he uses to respond to the pandemic. Dodd met with Walz staffers last week about his ideas for changing state statutes on emergency powers to give lawmakers more control, but reached no agreement. And in the Senate, Democrats last week renewed their threat to withhold their votes unless Republicans agreed to comprehensive policing accountability measures. They have a $1.35 billion state bond. I mean, these are probably going to be state municipal bonds that they're going to issue. $1.35 billion. They have the money. So President Trump is denied $500 million, so they have access to the money. So this is really interesting. So President Trump, not only, this is really, really hilarious. This is really, really hilarious. So they can go ahead and they can issue state and municipal bonds to acquire the what was it? Well over $1.35 billion. This is an article, second special legislative session to begin Monday, July 13, 2020. This is hilarious. Special session is being called to address police reform and accountability, as well as a bonding bill. So President Trump just recently, and check out my segment prior to this one, denied $500 million. By the way, he gave FEMA money to Arkansas that had, issues with natural disasters. But this is really hilarious and amusing. Media throughout, first of all, the vast majority of protests are very peaceful. But apparently, you have $1.4 billion in property damage, according to unbelievable. $1.4 billion in property damage, according to one estimate, throughout the country. So $1.4 billion in property damage throughout the country. Then you have 10,000 arrests. This does not help Democrats. These things do not. Tearing down statues doesn't help Democrats. Being apoplectic and fanatical and hysterical and seething and fuming doesn't help Democrats. That's not a positive emotion. That doesn't inspire votes. People don't say, "Oh my God." Then they say, "Well, suburban women are in Minnesota are going for Biden." That's not the way the electorate works. Okay, people of all ethnicities, no matter where they live, do not like chaos. Now, Democrats seem to think that mayhem and chaos are okay because, they're actually the most. Okay, the biggest racists are not in the Republican Party, and certainly not President Trump, who signed the First Step Act, who increased funding for historically black colleges and universities, who signed the first executive order combating anti-Semitism on college campuses. Democrats seem to think that people of all ethnicities, the businesses, and by the way, how many hundreds of millions of dollars in black-owned businesses have been destroyed? That's something that Democrats will never attest to. But they seem to think that chaos, mayhem, anger, resentment, discord, unrest, they seem to think that these are campaign strategies. These are good, sound campaign strategies. Not only did George Floyd get murdered in Minnesota, I support law enforcement, but of any whether it's doctors, any profession, you're going to have really bad actors, really bad people, and who cause major damage. It's a human life, and human life whether it's malpractice with doctors or with police officers or with anyone where a life is on the line. Whereas the vast majority of law enforcement and the vast majority of doctors are great, you're always going to find people like the man who murdered George Floyd in Minneapolis. The thing with Minneapolis is that it's a blue state, Democratic-run city, so much so that the mayor wanted to protest, and then the people there were like, "Get away, Frey!" It was kind of hilarious. But anyway, the whole thing with the absurd spin was that, well, everything's peaceful. Well, $500 million in property damage is not, and also it's disingenuous and duplicitous and just basically deceitful for the state of Minnesota to ask Trump or the federal government for $500 million when they have in their state legislature a vote for $1.35 billion in municipal bonds. Okay, instated in municipal bonds. If they can raise that money with bonds, why do they need the money from the federal government when it's the governor's fault and the mayor's fault that the city had 1,500 buildings damaged? So 1,500 buildings damaged. It was in a Washington Examiner article. Washington Examiner, 1,500 buildings, Minnesota. How do you allow 1,500 buildings? And how do you allow just 1,500 buildings to just be damaged? I mean, having unrest is one thing. Walz, a Democrat, asked Trump to declare Minnesota a major disaster zone. Why, if everything was peaceful? I mean, Pelosi will never attest to this. Democrats, media will. The Washington Post. Do you think if it was conservatives peacefully obliterating 1,500 buildings or damaging 1,500 buildings in one city, do you think the Washington Post? You think if it was Trump supporters, do you think they would? Nobody would hear about it. It would be Armageddon. It would be the end of the world. This is just one city. Now, Walz, a Democrat, asked Trump to declare Minnesota in a request for the Federal Emergency Management Agency on July 2nd, after more than 1,500 buildings were damaged, totaling over $500 million in damages. This is Andrew Mark Miller, Washington Examiner. 1,500 buildings. And it's unbelievable because they have access to the money. Now, they have to borrow it, but it was your fault. George Floyd was murdered by a Minneapolis police officer. Okay, that's the mayor's fault. That's the mayor's responsibility, I should say. And the governor and the mayor should have focused on protecting the city. Minnesota's going to go to Trump. I do not think Minnesota's going to go to Democrats. That's 10 electoral college votes. And Trump denying funding just forces people to look. And people in Minnesota, if you live in Minnesota, give me your thoughts. Am I wrong? I think that because if you look at 2016, if it wasn't for Gary Johnson, he would have won the state. And he won most of the counties. In most of these regions where it was close, President Trump won most of the counties. And nobody cares. Like, people do not care about Twitter. Again, like today, there was a whole uproar over Twitter. President Trump cannot just retweet. He has to, no more retweets. No more retweets. But anyway, what I'm trying to say, what I'm telling you, ladies and gentlemen, is the following. President Trump is doing a lot better. He's, not only is he on pace to win, he will win. The polls are pure public relations. Pure public relations. They do not reflect reality. When President Trump goes 8 years, he will have a mandate with the Durham probe, with William Barr, with bringing home Americans. President Trump signed a deal to bring home Americans from Afghanistan after 20 years, America's longest running military conflict ever. And longest running war. And Democrats are oblivious. Media, they don't care. Do you understand? They care more about, this is the Democratic Party. They care more about Trump's tweets than American soldiers coming home to their families, their wives, their husbands, their fathers, their mothers, their sisters, their brothers, their children, their sons, their daughters. Democrats care more. I mean, you have people that they're completely imploding. The left is imploding. It's like they don't see it. And I used to be, it's like a person who left a cult. I used to be part of the left. I can tell you right now, they're turning on each other more than ever. People are turning, and there's an undercurrent. Because, it's interesting, it's funny, it's hilarious. I watch I don't watch them regularly, but I see what all the entire left is doing. Most of them don't like me. But I see exactly all what they're doing. And even the ones that I don't really like, never really followed, they're all turning on one another. They're all turning on one another. And everything that's happening to J.K. Rowling and Noam Chomsky is happening to left-leaning YouTubers with millions of subs or hundreds of thousands, and it's not pretty. They're turning on one another. There's zero unity. There's not even a uniform or agreed upon disdain for President Trump. Some really dislike him. Some don't think he's that bad. Some think Democrats are worse, but they would never vote for Trump. So, I mean, look, they have access to $1.35 billion. They are being disingenuous, saying, oh my goodness, we don't have the money. They have the access to the money. The problem, though, is that they're not going to get the money from the federal government because they could get $1.35 billion in bonds. And because of that, Minnesota voters are going to have to look at those. They're not going to rebuild Minneapolis until after the election. So when people go into urban areas throughout the country that have to be rebuilt, or that have seen unrest and lives lost, you're not talking about voter turnout. So I don't know what Democrats are thinking, and whatever it is that they're thinking is they're setting themselves up. You have to also understand, President Trump's going to win the election. It's going to be Hillary Clinton. And by the way, 14 minutes, and come on, you got to give me credit. That's 14 minutes. I didn't bring up the fact that Biden is not going to be nominee. Hillary Clinton is going to be nominee. She's the only chance they have. But this doesn't help the popular vote. They think that there's enough people who can't stand President Trump. At the end of the day, Trump's personality takes a back seat to 1,500 buildings damaged, and states begging for $500 million in funding. Give me your thoughts below. Check out my live streams this evening and every evening. If you want to support my voice long term, my Patreon is below. Your support is greatly appreciated, ladies and gentlemen. It is greatly appreciated, and it allows me to do what I do. Also, subscribe to H.A. Goodman's other channel right now. And if you want to be part of, so that's a channel. I'm almost at 16,000 subs. Let's get it to 20,000 subs before Clinton becomes nominee, because she will. Biden is That's the biggest joke of all time. And ladies and gentlemen, if you want to be part of a newsletter, it's contactgoodman78@gmail.com. This is absolutely hilarious. This is a story that not many people are talking about.